Well, good morning. I'm Congressman Adam Schiff, and I want to thank you all for being here today. I'm proud to be joined by Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murphy, and Representative Van Hollen in introducing the legislation. They have been tremendous leaders on gun violence, and I also want to thank the Brady Campaign to prevent gun violence for their work on this bill and on the issue of gun safety for many years now. Gun violence continues to be a scourge across our nation, from mass shootings in places like Charleston or Aurora, Newtown, to everyday drumbeat of Americans killed and injured by guns. Thousands of families are destroyed by gun violence every year, and there are steps that we can take to make a difference. Today we're here to talk about one reform that's gotten less attention but is among the most important actions that we could take in Congress. Few Americans have ever heard of the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, surely one of the more Orwellian-sounding bills to come out of Congress. But its passage in 2005 marked a victory for the NRA that they themselves called the most important for their organization in 20 years. The reason it was so important was that PLACA gave the gun industry, manufacturers, sellers, and even the NRA itself an unprecedented and unique immunity from liability in state and federal courts, where we require and expect of every other industry, whether car makers or drug companies, to act with reasonable care for the safety of the public. PLACA means the gun industry can act with near total impunity. Acting with reasonable care for the safety of others and facing the consequences when you don't is the minimum that we can expect and should expect from everyone in our society, and certainly from those who make and sell among the more dangerous consumer products on the market. Since PLACA became law, state and federal courts have dismissed numerous cases against gun industry actors, and doubtless many more cases were not brought at all. Responsible actors in the gun industry don't need this limitation on liability, and the irresponsible don't deserve it. To correct the error that Congress made in 2005, Senator Blumenthal, Murphy, Van Hollen, and myself are introducing the Equal Justice for Victims of Gun Violence Act, a bill that will repeal the liability immunity shield enshrined in PLACA. It will ensure that victims of gun violence can have their day in court, the same right we should guarantee to any American. We're also repealing a separate ban barring plaintiffs in civil cases from discovering and introducing gun trace data held by the ATF that is often needed to prove a pattern of negligence by a gun seller. I believe that if the firearm industry didn't have this unprecedented immunity, they would reform some of the practices that lead to the deaths of thousands of Americans who are killed with guns every year. They would do something about the fact that 5% of gun dealers sell 90% of the guns used in crimes. They would secure their supply chains so that huge numbers of guns aren't diverted into the black market or into private sales where they change hands with no background check. They would install simple safety devices that are proven to prevent accidental shootings. We know the gun lobby will fight as hard to keep PLACA as they fought to get it. This will be a long and difficult fight. But in granting immunity to the worst actors in the gun industry, Congress did tremendous harm to the goal that we all want to see, which is fewer families torn apart by guns. I got involved in this issue several years ago and introduced a variation of this bill. In the city that I represent, my hometown of Burbank, we lost a rookie police officer who was killed by a gang member. The family of that police officer brought a suit because the dealer that sold the gun that ended up being used by the killer sold a great many guns to straw purchasers, as indeed this gun had been sold to a straw purchaser. That dealer did not use reasonable care in making sure that the many guns it was selling to straw purchasers didn't end up in the hands of gang members like the one that shot and killed Matthew Pavelka. But that family was unable to prove that case in court, unable to take that case to court. And this bill, the repeal of PLACA, would change that. And I want to clarify one thing before I hand it off to the next speaker. There's an effort that was made both in the passage of this bill and in the opposition, in the passage of PLACA and the opposition to this bill, to say that if a dealer sells a gun to someone who merely uses it in a crime, that dealer shouldn't be held responsible without more. Well, we agree with that. This is not a bill that says merely because you sell a gun that's later used in crime that you're somehow responsible or liable. No, what this bill says is the gun industry shouldn't enjoy an immunity that no other industry enjoys for when it acts negligently, when it acts knowingly, when it acts in bad faith. So if that dealer or that manufacturer knowingly or negligently takes an action that causes the life of another, and that can be proven in court, those victims should have that day in court. That is as simple as what this bill is about. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce a leader on the issue of gun violence prevention, Senator Richard Blumenthal.
Thanks so much, Representative Schiff, for your leadership over many years, and I want to thank Congressman Van Hollen for being here as well and for taking the stand as he's done, and of course my great partner in this effort against gun violence, Senator Murphy. We're here to repeal a law that makes a mockery of American justice. It denies people their day in court. PLACA denies people their day in court. It bars the courthouse doors from a class of victims simply because they are victims of one industry, gun makers and dealers. That's unprecedented and unique in American history. And that's why it is a mockery of American justice. Our entire legal system is premised on the basic concept that manufacturers and professionals and literally everyone has to follow a certain standard of care. If you fail to clear the walk in front of your home, if you make a toaster that explodes, if you produce an automobile with a defective ignition switch or airbags that harm people, you are held to a standard of care. That's the basic concept of American justice for everyone except the gun industry. They have a special interest exception from American justice. It is an incredible testament to the power of the gun lobby and the NRA that they have been singled out alone among industries and people who do harm for this exemption. And we're very simply trying to give victims of gun violence the same day in court that every other American has when they are harmed by lawbreakers. And Congressman Schiff is right. Simply selling a gun or making a gun does not incur liability. It's when it's done in violation of the law, in violation of that basic standard of care, to do things as ordinary people would expect you to do when you're making something or dealing with other people. Now, you've probably heard me say, or others who are standing here, that Congress's failure to act is reprehensible in the face of gun violence. And I've said Congress is complicit in gun violence because of its failure to act in making background checks universal and banning straw purchases and illegal trafficking. The failure to act makes it complicit. Here, Congress has acted. It has acted to give gun manufacturers and dealers special treatment. So let's reverse that special treatment and give these manufacturers the same level playing field that everyone else has in our society. What are the practical consequences? Well, victims can seek some remedies and rights and redress. They have some access to the courthouse. They can bring their cases in court, which right now they are barred from doing. Remember, they can't even stand in front of a judge and begin to present evidence. They're barred on a motion to dismiss at the outset when they first come into court. So they get some justice. But equally important, it will create strong incentives to make guns safer and smarter. That's the way our justice system works. People who are held responsible for doing things wrong are given a great incentive to do things better and right. And so this law will mean that the bad actors can be held accountable, and the good gun manufacturers and dealers will have a better, more level playing field. And they will have an incentive to lead and make products safer and better. So all we're saying is, let's eliminate the absolute wall of immunity, the implacable shield that PLACA gives manufacturers now, and give victims and others, like the city of New York that was barred from bringing a suit, access to our courthouses. It's not just individuals, it's also governmental entities that are harmed by the costs of gun violence. Anybody who is harmed by gun violence, when there is illegal action, ought to be given the opportunity to seek some justice. And now I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague and friend and a partner in this effort, Senator Chris Murphy.
Thank you very much, Senator Blumenthal. Thank you to Representative Schiff for being such a champion on this issue for years, and to my great friend Chris Van Hollen for being a part of this effort as well. When this law passed the United States Senate, its chief sponsor said this. At the time, the record on the Senate floor records Senator Larry Craig as saying, "This bill will not prevent a single victim from obtaining relief for wrongs done to them by anyone in the gun industry. This legislation will not bar the courthouse doors to victims who have been harmed by the negligence or misdeeds of anyone in the gun industry." That was a lie then, and it is a lie today. The result of this legislation has been to bar victims from even making the case for restitution in courts of law. A family like that of a victim in Alaska, where an individual wearing a garbage bag displaying erratic behavior walked into a gun show and asked for one of the cheapest guns that he could buy. The dealer put a weapon down on the counter and then walked away. When he came back, that gun was gone, and it was used by that disturbed individual to kill someone that he was in a dispute with. Now, whether or not that negligence rose to the level of liability is a question for a court of law. But that case was never heard because the court ruled that it was barred by the statute that its sponsors at the time said would never stop someone from getting into a courthouse to make their case. The secondary effect of this, as Senator Blumenthal and Senator Schiff noted, is to effectively let the gun industry off the hook for making a safer product or to create safer supply chains. I remember I had a conversation with my 7-year-old about my smartphone, showing him how it needed my thumbprint in order to log on. And he thought it was absurd that that was technology embedded into a telephone, but not technology embedded into a firearm. With the industry knowing that they will never, ever be on the hook for knowingly making unsafe products, there is no incentive to ever invest in the kind of rudimentary technology that would assure that firearms are not used in unsafe ways. The NRA owned Congress for a large part of the 1990s and early 2000s. This bill represented in many ways the pinnacle of their power. The NRA isn't in charge of Congress any longer, but the vestiges of their era of control still linger. It's incumbent upon us to allow people to get into court, to make their case and to put real incentives on the gun industry to make their products safer. I'm glad to join in this effort and very glad to introduce my good friend, Congressman Chris Van Hollen.
Thank you, Senator Murphy, Senator Blumenthal, for your leadership on these issues. To my good friend, Congressman Adam Schiff, thank you for your leadership. To the Brady Campaign and all the people and families of victims who have been part of this great effort to reduce and end gun violence in America, we salute you. The current exemption in law is a green light for negligence for gun manufacturers and dealers. It says you can behave with impunity, and as my colleagues have said, by giving them a green light for negligence, you take away their incentive to save lives. You take away their incentive to develop guns that have built-in safety devices, so-called smart guns. You take away their incentive to prevent sales to straw dealers. So we are giving them this unique immunity, and we are giving them this green light to behave recklessly and put other people's lives in danger, a kind of benefit that we provide to no other industry here. And the consequences are very real. There was a gun dealer in Rockville, Maryland. His name was Andy Raymond. Back in 2014, he was thinking about selling a smart gun. One of these guns where it's designed so that only the owner of the gun can fire it. He has a shop called Engage Armaments. He's a gun advocate, an NRA advocate. But when he wanted to sell that smart gun that would save lives and prevent accidental shootings, the NRA and the gun industry came after him. There were protests and death threats against him, and they threatened to shut down the shop of a gun owner who wanted to sell a gun that had these safety devices that would save lives. And if they didn't have this special protection, as my colleagues have said, there would be incentives for them to sell the product that did not create unnecessarily harm and deaths. I remember my first encounter with the NRA was when I was in the Maryland State Legislature. A young boy went to his neighbor's house to play, and he was shot dead in an accidental shooting. I teamed up with his mother, Carol Price, who wanted to make sure that kind of awful tragedy didn't happen to another family. And in the state of Maryland, we passed the law. It was the first law in the country at the time that required guns sold in Maryland have these built-in safety locks. The NRA fought that bill tooth and nail, a bill simply to prevent accidental gun shootings. And now they're working with others to threaten down gun shops that want to sell smart guns, which would help save lives. So this legislation is about getting rid of a green light for negligence, and it's about having the gun industry play by the same rules as everybody else, rules that require them to abide by the standard of care so that we save lives. And we save lives like Josh Adamez, who at least should have had his day in court to show that kind of negligence and was denied that opportunity because of this NRA-sponsored, gun industry-sponsored law that's in place. So I'm really proud to join with my colleagues here today to say to the gun industry, you got to play by the same rules as everybody else. And if you do, it will save lives.
Thank you, Chris. And I'd now like to introduce Hector Adames. But let me tell you a little bit about his family before he takes the microphone. Some years ago, 11-year-old Billy Swan of Illinois accidentally shot and killed his friend Josh Adames while playing with his father's handgun. This was in 2001. Josh's uncle, Hector, who is going to be speaking shortly, sued the manufacturer Beretta in 2009 under a product liability theory that Beretta not only failed to include an inexpensive device on the firearm that prevents a gun from firing without a magazine, but also failed to include a warning that the weapon could be used without a magazine. That case was dismissed under PLACA. Josh's grandmother, Rosalia Adames, is here with us today as well. And now I'd like to invite Hector to come and make a few remarks. Hector.
Thank you. My name is Hector Adames, and I know from personal experience how the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act robs gun violence victims and their family of their right to justice. When my nephew Joshua was 13 years old, he was shot and killed by a friend who was playing with his father's gun. The boy thought the gun was unloaded, but because the gun manufacturer had not installed an inexpensive and effective safety mechanism, the boy had no way of knowing the gun still had a bullet in the chamber. The decision has affected my family and have changed us forever. Joshua would be 28 years old today, but we are still devastated. He never had the chance to learn how to drive, never had the chance to graduate from high school, or serve his country as I have. He never got a chance to get married or have a family. He was robbed of those experiences, and the world was robbed of him. But what made this tragedy even worse is the fact that we were robbed of our right to justice under the law. We sued the gun manufacturer, hoping that it could hold them accountable for Joshua's death and forced them to install common sense safety devices in their guns. We know it wouldn't bring Joshua back, but we were hoping that we could save other families' lives from this kind of tragedy. Excuse me. Despite the work of the Brady Campaign in representing us, our case was dismissed because of the CAA. For too long, Congress had shielded the gun industry from responsibility for the people its products kill every day. For too long, Congress has enabled the gun industry to put profits ahead of people. It's time to repeal this law and hold the corporate gun lobby accountable for the pain, suffering it has caused my family and thousands of others every single day. Because only when the gun industry begins to feel some of the pain itself, they may consider changing their ways. Now, we lost Joshua May 5th, 2001. PLACA wasn't passed until 2005. Our case was already 4 years old, and yet PLACA was able to kick a 4-year-old case. In my hometown of Chicago, we have 253 shootings as of January 26. We are 26 days into 2016. And of those shootings, 46 of them resulted in deaths. Of those deaths, roughly 5% of these gun dealers are these bad apples. And they're accounting for roughly about 86% of these shootings. So I just ask that you think about that. We're not trying to take away or challenge the Second Amendment. We just want the same protection that any individual or family has. And there should be no industry or company or that's above these kind of prosecutions. There's no protection for your community or your families if we're going to continue to allow complete immunity for people who have suffered like we have. So I thank you guys for inviting us here and hearing our story. But I want you to keep in mind that I'm only one individual representing one family, specifically Joshua. But I am just one voice, and there are thousands of us. So thank you.
Hector and Rosalia, thank you very much for being here and for sharing your family's story. And incidentally, that device that prevents a gun from firing a round in the chamber when the cartridge has been removed, the magazine removed, costs about $1. I'd now like to introduce Dan Gross, the president of the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. Dan's brother was severely wounded when he was shot on the observation deck of the Empire State Building in 1997. Which prompted him to become a leader in gun violence prevention. Dan.
Thank you, Congressman Schiff. Hector, Rosalia, our hearts break for you. Can't imagine the courage that it takes for you to stand up here and so courageously share your story. And I want you to know that certainly everybody up here and millions more Americans out there are committed to join you in the fight to make sure that what happened to Josh doesn't happen to other families. And thank you again, Congressman Schiff, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murphy, Congressman Van Hollen, for partnering with the Brady Center to lead the charge to repeal PLACA and end a deadly decade of special legal protection for the gun industry. The Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, PLACA. The corporate gun lobby, as you've heard, called it their most significant piece of legislation in 20 years. And it's no wonder, because it provides the gun industry with special legal protection that literally no other industry in our nation enjoys. And what's very good for the corporate gun lobby, as you've heard so clearly here today, is very bad for families across America, families like Hector and Rosalia's, who've been denied the opportunity to seek justice from an industry whose products kill 33,000 Americans every year. Instead of justice, victims of gun violence like Rosalia and Hector are treated like second-class citizens just because their loved one happened to be killed by a gun instead of any other object. Think about how absurd that is. Had Josh Adamis been killed by anything else, his family would have had the opportunity to seek justice. If someone had killed him with a BB gun that's negligently manufactured or sold, someone could be held accountable for that negligence. But if it's a real gun, thanks to PLACA, no justice. If a negligently manufactured teddy bear results in the choking death of a child, that manufacturer can be held accountable. But because Josh Adamis was killed with a handgun, thanks to PLACA, his family is denied justice. In 2016, guns are expected to pass cars in this country as the deadliest product. Now, not all of those deaths are the result of negligence, but too many are. And while the victim of a negligently manufactured car can hold a manufacturer accountable, the victim of a negligently manufactured gun or a negligently sold gun, thanks to PLACA, can't do a thing. 9 children in the U.S. are shot unintentionally every single day. Gun manufacturers have the opportunity to prevent many of these tragedies. And the disgraceful thing is they know it. If Beretta, as you've heard, added a simple safety feature that costs well under $10 and has been around for 100 years, Josh Adamis would be alive today. We're not talking about smart guns here. We're talking about mildly intelligent guns would save lives. But the corporate gun lobby and the Congress people who passed PLACA simply don't care. They don't care about the lives that are being lost. They don't worry about safety because they don't have to, because PLACA has guaranteed they can't be held accountable, that all the negligence in the world won't hurt their bottom line. Of course, you hear the usual tired talking points from the corporate gun lobby and the politicians who shamelessly do its bidding, and there are vestiges of that left, as you've heard. That PLACA is somehow about protecting the rights of decent, law-abiding Americans or rural constituents. It's even in the name, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And in this town, Orwellian was the word you hear before, well known for its deceptive and disingenuously named legislation, this one may actually take the cake. PLACA has absolutely nothing to do with protecting lawful commerce. In fact, it works entirely against it by encouraging negligence, by actually providing financial incentive to make a dangerous product and to sell it to dangerous people. PLACA doesn't protect lawful commerce. It protects negligent commerce. It protects irresponsible commerce. And it certainly doesn't protect the safety of the American people or the rights of victims like Hector and Rosalia to seek justice. In the decades since PLACA passed, Brady's Legal Action Project, as you've heard, has fought on behalf of victims like Josh Adamus and their families to reform the negligent and dangerous practices of the gun industry and to challenge the law in the courts. And considering what we've been up against because of PLACA, we've had some pretty extraordinary success. But ultimately, if we want true justice, we have to do away with this terrible law once and for all. We thank Congressman Schiff, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murphy, Congressman Van Hollen for your tremendous leadership, and we're proud to have worked with you to draft this vitally important bill. And now we call on members of Congress to co-sponsor it and immediately schedule a vote to pass it, so victims of gun violence can have the opportunity to seek the justice that they deserve and to hold the gun industry accountable to do its part to make this the safer nation that we all deserve. Thank you.
Dan, thank you very much. It now gives me a great pleasure to introduce Chelsea Parsons. She is the Vice President for Guns and Crime Policy at the Center for American Progress. Prior to joining CAP, she was General Counsel to the New York City Criminal Justice Coordinator. Chelsea.
Good morning. I'm very pleased to be here today to support the introduction of this crucial legislation. As Senator Murphy said, for decades, the gun lobby and its allies have run rampant in Washington, pushing through harmful legislation that has slowly but surely eroded our nation's gun laws, leaving all of our communities vulnerable to what we know is a uniquely American problem of gun violence. They've tied the hands of federal law enforcement, particularly ATF, from being able to effectively enforce the laws we do have. They've slammed the brakes on all efforts to research the causes of gun violence by the Centers for Disease Control. This is a public health crisis that kills more than 33,000 Americans every year. And with PLACA, the gun lobby succeeded in closing the courthouse doors to victims of gun violence and their families who've been harmed by the negligence of the gun industry. As everyone has said, no other industry in this country enjoys the kind of sweeping immunity that PLACA has given to the gun industry. All other consumer products industries are subject to civil lawsuits for negligence, and it's the availability of such lawsuits that incentivizes industry leaders to adopt safety measures and best practices to minimize the risk of harm that can be caused by their products. But for the industry that produces and distributes one of the most uniquely dangerous and lethal products when it is in the wrong hands, there is no such incentive. PLACA is not only bad policy, it's an unfair law that re-victimizes those who've been most impacted by the negligence of the gun industry, such as the Adamus family, who I really appreciate you being here today to share your story, and who can't seek justice in a court of law. I'd like to thank Representative Schiff and Van Hollen, Senators Murphy and Blumenthal for your leadership on this issue, for introducing this bill, which will repeal this harmful, unnecessary and unprecedented immunity for the gun industry and restore balance to this area of law by allowing good faith lawsuits against the gun industry to proceed. I think a decade of immunity for the gun industry is far more than enough, and I urge Congress to take up this legislation as soon as possible and send it to the President's desk. Thank you.
We'd be happy to respond to a few questions. Yes.
How does this distinguish between an effective product and one that's just lacking some sort of safety feature that I presume would be up to the courts to decide during litigation?
Well, I'll take a stab at it and let Dan go into more detail on it. When you look at the course of the litigation over PLACA, you find a crazy quilt of court decisions, allowing some to go forward on negligence theories, allowing others to be barred, allowing some to go forward in terms of potentially in terms of negligent manufacture, but not in terms of product defect. And the long and the short of it is there's no reason to provide a special immunity in any of these cases. If there is negligence, if there is a product defect, if there's a negligent manufacture, if there's a negligent entrustment, the common law rules of due care and negligence ought to apply. The common law rules, statutory rules of product defect litigation ought to apply. We shouldn't have a different standard. We don't need to have these kind of inconsistent holdings in the lower courts and the courts of appeal. So it's been very fact-specific, very case-specific. Some cases, for example, like the Adames, where you have a $1 safety device that could have been incorporated, should have been incorporated, are barred, and at the same time, there have been some actions that have been allowed to go forward. I will just add one other thing, and Senator Blumenthal has actually tried these cases. He's also a great person to respond to this, and that is there's a combination of two factors here that have really denied people justice in court. One are these immunity provisions in PLACA and these ambiguously written exceptions. The other is that in conjunction with some language from Mr. Tiehart, which prohibits victims from getting the information they need to prove negligence, the gun trace data. And the combination of those two things have really closed the courthouse doors to those seeking relief. But Senator, if you want to take a stab, and Bob may, Dan may as well.
You've given an excellent answer, but your question really goes to the heart of what liability is in any industry, in any activity. What is the standard of care? What should someone have known or knew? What should someone have done or failed to do to make the product acceptably safe? So the standard of care can vary according to industry, but the case law develops certain criteria for what the standard is in that industry. And I think there are a couple of key points here. One is that simply bringing a lawsuit or getting into court doesn't guarantee victory. In fact, as somebody who has tried cases, I can tell you the burden is on the plaintiff to establish legal responsibility and wrongdoing. So a defective product, a negligently manufactured product, a product sold recklessly and wantonly to someone who was obviously going to do harm with that product would violate that standard of care. And I want to make 2 points here, 2 very practical points. One is an overwhelming majority of crime guns, that is, guns used in criminal action, are sold by a very tiny minority of dealers. Or to put it differently, there is a very small group of bad actors among the dealers who are overwhelmingly responsible for the sales of guns that they know are going to be used in crimes or are sold to people who are so dangerous they shouldn't have them. We're talking about dealers who knowingly, wantonly, recklessly violate a standard of care that should be applied to them. And the second point, which is sort of, I think, illustrates the absurdity and abhorrent nature of PLACA. You know, in some jurisdictions and for some products, there is actually strict liability. In other words, somebody's hurt by a certain kind of product, and the manufacturer is automatically liable. That is very far from what we are urging here. In some jurisdictions, by the way, if your dog bites me, you are strictly liable. No excuses. It's your fault. You pay. And yet, for a gun, there is no liability at all, absolute immunity from liability. So this rule is so antithetical to American justice, in fact, to justice generally, because it prevents somebody from going after truly egregious wrongdoing. The dealer who sells to a known criminal, who then kills somebody, or the dealer who sells to somebody who is obviously dangerous because of some mental illness, that dealer is absolutely immune, shielded completely from any liability. The standard of care could be developed, but it's been prevented by this absolute immunity. So I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but you asked a legal question, and you asked it of a lawyer, so you're going to get a long-winded answer.
I'm glad you had the chance to give a lawyer's perspective before I gave my layperson's answer to that question, but a layperson who works with victims of that negligence every day. It's not that this bill establishes a standard of care. It provides the opportunity for victims and for all of us to hold gun manufacturers and sellers accountable for negligence and reckless irresponsibility.
Yes.
Congressman and Senator Blumenthal, could you address the timing of all of this? This has been the law of the land for 10 years, and I know that you've all been working diligently and quite earnestly towards this for a long time, but this is happening. We're here a week before the Iowa caucuses, where this has become a major point of distinction between Secretary Clinton and Senator Sanders. Is this an effort to raise that distinction, and do you think that Senator Sanders' support for this bill back in 2005 is a disqualifying point should be a disqualifying point for Democratic voters?
Well, you know, I can say this. I introduced this legislation last session, and I'm not prescient enough to know what the course of the presidential race would look like this session. So the motivation behind the legislation is very much to repeal this immunity shield that the gun industry enjoys. Look, without personalizing it to the presidential candidates, I think it was a tragedy that this bill was passed PLACA in the first place. We are trying to end the harm by this, but the harm has already been done in the sense that for the last decade, gun manufacturers and dealers have had little incentive to act with a reasonable standard of care. And those who have been denied their day in court during that decade have been denied their day in court. Improvements we might have seen in safety procedures and protocols, both by manufacturers and dealers, haven't been implemented for the last 10 years. So we will not be able to get back to where we were. Some will have irrevocably been deprived of their justice. But we can prevent the injury from continuing from this point forward. And I don't think any of us expect this is going to be easy. At the same time, I think as the President has alluded, we need to keep on advocating, keep on pushing until we reach that tipping point where we can get things accomplished. And I hope for the sake of those who may become future victims that point comes sooner rather than later. Did you want to?
Yeah, and I think, you know, putting aside the presidential politics, I think that there is a sense that the vice-like throttle held by the gun lobby is breaking. and that the American public is awakening to the public health crisis that this epidemic of gun violence poses in 30,000 deaths every year. If there were 30,000 deaths as a result of Ebola or the flu, the nation would respond with dramatic action. This kind of action is simply to treat the gun lobby or to treat gun manufacturers and dealers the same as everybody else. So I think there is a sense that we have a chance for the first time to break that throttle or grip that the gun lobby has exercised.
Yes. We'd be happy to see what Senator Sanders has in mind. And if it's a reporting requirement that doesn't impede the repeal of the legislation, that would be one thing. If, on the other hand, the application of the provisions is contingent on some kind of report, that would be very problematic. So we'd have to wait to see what he would propose. Yes.
It's kind of a combination question, maybe Senator Blumenthal can address. For one, what do you say to the gun manufacturers, and many of them in your own home state of Connecticut, who will say opening the courthouse doors in this manner will bring forth a flood of lawsuits that will drive us out of business? That's sort of one question. And the second question, in terms of this legislation, is there a sort of a model in your minds in terms of, tobacco, automobiles, past instances where litigation or the threat of litigation has led to substantive safety mechanisms within that industry?
Well, that is actually an excellent question. Obviously, a very pertinent one. Compare tobacco. Tobacco is a product that, when used as intended, kills the customer. In the overwhelming number of cases of people who smoke, serious illness results, often fatal. The tobacco industry was sued, and the vast majority of private plaintiff cases have been unsuccessful, despite these fears that the tobacco industry would be overwhelmed in court. So I think the comparison is a good one. The mere fact that someone has a right to go to court doesn't mean they will succeed. There is a legal standard that has to be met. The burden is always on the complaining party, the plaintiff. It's a high burden of proof, preponderance of the evidence. There are all kinds of thresholds along the way. And the mere fact of removing immunity by no means guarantees that anyone is going to succeed. And there are all kinds of defenses to a potential lawsuit, as there were for the tobacco industry, that can be used by very able lawyers that no doubt will be hired by gun manufacturers or dealers. So I think that the parade of horribles raised by the gun manufacturers or dealers are largely imaginary and certainly exaggerated. And again, there are a lot of products that are potentially dangerous. Automobiles when misused, drugs when wrongly taken, explosives when negligently used. But the gun industry has been singled out for this very special exception that means they are not held to ordinary standards of justice. And I have not seen any evidence that the financial impact of removing this complete shield would diminish the financial success of any manufacturer or dealer.
If I could just add on to that, too, to give one other illustration, and that would be the automobile industry. If you look at the automobile industry, it has over the years developed additional safety precautions. It's gone from seat belts to airbags. It's gone from front airbags to side airbags. Those changes, I think, are a result of the industry wanting to exercise continually improving duty of care to its customers. The gun industry has not had that incentive. And this would align the gun industry with every other industry, provide an incentive for it to continue to improve its products, to raise the standard of care and raise the safety for the users as well as the broader community. Last question, if anyone has any further. Yes.
When you're looking at trying to advance this, is this the kind of thing where you think there's any plausible opening while the Republicans are controlling the House and the Senate, or is this more of a long-term strategy, looking through at least when if the Democrats were to take back the Senate next year?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult with the current majorities in both houses. At the same time, it really will depend on the public and whether they insist on an end to the status quo in which we have mass shootings every week, if not every day, where we have gun violence certainly every day in cities across the country. If people demand change, they can get it from a GOP Congress as well as a Democratic one. And I do think, as the Senator was alluding, we are reaching a tipping point, though, where the public is ready to say enough is enough. And that makes everything possible, even in the current majority. Senator?
And just to finish on Mr. Friedman's question, in many industries, the requirements for proper safety have actually added jobs. Innovation and technology adds jobs. And the same arguably would be true in the gun industry, that actually safer and better products would create jobs in places where they are now.
Thank you very much.
Great job. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Senator, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Congressman, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.